We remember Vikings as fearless raiders, masters of the sword and sea, but what history rarely whispers is what came after the battles ended. When the last prayer of a dying monk faded and the smoke of burning chapels rose into the dawn, the true horror began. Not for the fallen warriors whose torment had ended, but for the nuns who remained. Women who had sworn their lives to Christ now faced a nightmare that made death look merciful. You think you know Viking brutality, even the sagas fall silent on what came next. If you value real, documented Viking history, subscribe. It helps us bring more truth to light, and let us know from which city are you watching this. This episode draws from Ibn Fadlan's writings and archaeological discoveries at Dublin's slave markets. Let's go back to the year 845. The monastery at Clonmacnoise falls to Thorgest and his fleet. 43 monks die defending the altar. The chronicler records the slaughter, and then his ink stops. He never writes what became of the nuns, but archaeology does. Excavations at Dublin's Wood Quay revealed the infrastructure of Viking slave markets. Iron shackles sized for slender wrists, ankle rings no larger than a child's, and warehouse foundations built to confine living bodies. The Dublin Vikings didn't only raid for gold and relics, they raided for flesh. A captured nun had value, not as a servant of God, but as inventory. Runic inscriptions from Schleswig show actual price carvings: 20 silver pieces for a young nun, 15 for an older sister, 10 if she was wounded during the raid. Receipts carved in stone. But here's what the sagas won't say. Being sold was the merciful outcome. In 862, Vikings sacked the monastery at Portmarnock. Irish annals record 47 warriors dead, and then silence. No mention of the nuns taken from the cloisters. But soil samples from nearby bogs reveal another truth. 23 female bodies, everyone showing the same brutal signs: blunt trauma to the skull, defensive wounds on arms, shattered ribs from prolonged assault. These weren't battle deaths, they were ritualized killings, methodical, repeated. Carbon dating places the deaths within days of the raid. They died after surrender, after captivity, once their fate had been decided. And the Vikings always made the same decision. In 871, the great heathen army captured Reading. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicles record the defeat of King Ethelred, but nothing of what befell the holy sisters in the abbey. The earth speaks where the records fall silent. At the old Saxon palace site, stains of iron oxide, blood iron, were found beneath the stones, enough for dozens of people. Viking war culture had laws, savage ones. A defeated man's wife or nun, under his protection, became the property of her captor, not as a servant, as his woman. The Old Norse called it Kona Eine, owned woman, property that breeds. The Gragas law codes from Iceland describe the process. The captor declares ownership before witnesses, the woman's will means nothing, the act is legal, the children born from it are legitimate by law, though conceived through violence. But even this twisted version of marriage was not the worst fate. In 878, Norse raiders attacked the monastery of Bangor. The annals record its destruction, not what followed. Archaeology fills the silence again. Burn layers reveal female bones arranged in ceremonial patterns. Viking funerary custom demanded human sacrifice, the killing of women as part of a warrior's send-off. Ibn Fadlan himself witnessed such a ritual on the Volga in 921, a slave girl raped, drugged, and strangled before her master's pyre. He saw it once. Archaeology proves it happened countless times. Analysis of Scandinavian boat burials shows the same pattern. Female skeletons showing marks of strangulation, traces of henbane and other hallucinogenic plants in their teeth. Drugs meant to dull fear and force compliance. They died seeing visions. Perhaps they thought it was divine light. Perhaps it was something far darker. By 907, the Great Army winters at Thetford. Chronicles list cattle stolen, churches burned, but nothing of the nuns taken. Yet the midden heaps near the site tell another story. Among the refuse, archaeologists found infant bones, dozens, each one showing signs of deliberate skull trauma. These weren't stillbirths, they were murders. Children born from Viking assaults upon nuns, children neither faith nor father wanted to claim. Their deaths were systematic, calculated. Viking law was clear. If the mother was property, the child was property. If it could not serve, it did not live. Entire monastic settlements vanish from the records after Viking raids. Places like Whitby, Iona, and Coldingham, where populations of holy women disappear overnight. Excavations at Repton, the Viking Great Army's camp from 873 to 874, unearthed 249 skeletons. Only 63 were female. The numbers don't lie, the rest were taken. Isotope studies reveal the women buried there weren't English. They came from Ireland, Scotland, and Wales. Christian nuns dragged from sanctuaries and sold across the sea. The lucky ones died in childbirth. The rest vanished into the slave routes, north to Scandinavia, east toward the rivers of Rusas, south into the markets of Islam. Dublin wasn't just a port, it was a human processing centre. Each new wharf expanded the trade, and behind its whitewashed walls, the nuns of Christ were strict of everything, even their names. Their vows were eternal, their torment even longer. These weren't temporary prisons, they were long-term storage sites, human warehouses. 9th century Arabic sources described Viking slave caravans stretching from the Baltic all the way to Baghdad. The nuns bought the highest prices in the eastern markets. Fair-skinned Celtic and Germanic nuns were treated as exotic treasures, symbols of luxury and status among foreign buyers. The Vikings knew the demand and met it with brutal efficiency. They didn't just raid monasteries, they supplied a global trade in sanctity and suffering. Their eastern route passed through Novgorod and Kiev, a 1,000-mile descent along the Dnieper River. Ship manifests carved in runes listed human cargo alongside furs and amber, 20 nuns per vessel, a standard shipment. But the worst fate wasn't servitude, or forced conversion, or even ritual sacrifice. It was reserved for the nuns who resisted. In 914, Irish forces retook Dublin from the Norse. The annals of the Four Masters record the liberation, but not the horror discovered just beyond the city walls. Excavations reveal execution pits, stone-lined holes built not for death, but for prolonged dying. Inside, archaeologists found skeletons showing deliberate trauma, legs broken to prevent escape, arms shattered to stop self-harm. The nuns were kept alive while they died. Each pit measured 6 feet deep and 3 feet wide, too narrow to lie down, too shallow to stand. The victims perished in a crouch, over days, sometimes weeks. Viking law codes describe such punishments for slaves or captives who struck their masters, burial alive, but never swiftly. The pit was dug shallow enough for air, deep enough to deny escape. Death came slowly from thirst, starvation, or exposure. Archaeological soil samples from Dublin confirm long decomposition periods, proof that these nuns were left to die over time. The cruelty was calculated. Some pits were lined with jagged stones, others filled with cold standing water. The purpose wasn't execution. It was spectacle, suffering performed for those still alive. Other captured nuns were forced to watch. The message was clear: obedience or torment. In 919, Norwegian King Harald Fairhair consolidated his power. Civil wars ended and Viking expansion slowed, but the slave networks remained. Peace didn't end the trade, it perfected it. The same routes once used for raids became organized systems of trafficking. Records show Viking merchants offering guaranteed delivery of human cargo. Byzantine trade agreements even listed such terms. The Rus-Byzantine Treaty of 944 priced slaves by category. Young nuns commanded premium rates, pregnant ones sold at discount, and children under 10 were nearly worthless. This wasn't chaos, it was commerce. By 937, at the Battle of Brunanburh, 5 Irish and Anglo-Saxon kingdoms united to crush the Norse. They won decisively, but what they found in the Viking baggage trains defied belief. Portable breeding pens, iron frameworks designed for living prisoners, chain assemblies small enough for children, mobile slave markets that moved with the army. These pens could be dismantled and rebuilt in hours, modular compounds for long-term confinement. Archaeologists found anchor rings worn smooth by chains, evidence of constant use. The engineering was efficient, systematic, horrifying. The captured nuns were not treated as casualties of war, they were the prize itself. living resources to be collected, processed, and distributed. Viking commerce depended on their forced labor. Spiritual women turned into the machinery of an empire's economy. Archaeological surveys of Norse settlements from Dublin to Hedeby show a consistent pattern. Every major town had holding facilities, every port a processing station. The infrastructure of captivity was everywhere, hidden in plain sight. In 954, when Eric Bloodaxe died at Stainmore and the last Viking kingdom in England collapsed, the system didn't vanish. It changed hands. Christian kingdoms inherited Viking slave networks and repurposed them. Monastic records from the following century list vast numbers of indentured servants. These weren't volunteers. They were rebranded slaves, nuns once seized by Vikings, now serving under Christian masters. The words changed, the chains remained. By 966, with Harold Hardrada's death at Stamford Bridge, the Viking Age in England officially ended, but the graves told a darker story. Mass burials filled with nuns, dated to the same years as Viking defeats, suggested something sinister. When Viking power collapsed, the evidence had to disappear, the witnesses silenced. Excavations at Repton revealed a mass grave sealed in 986, containing the remains of 236 individuals, all female, all showing signs of organised execution. Isotope analysis revealed they were Norse, not English. These were not prisoners. They were Viking nuns, women of faith living within Norse colonies, executed by their own kind as English forces advanced. The method was identical to that used on their captives. Blunt force trauma, strangulation, poisoning, fathers killed daughters, abbots executed their own novices, husbands murdered wives, not in rage, but in grim ritual. They knew what awaited captured nuns, for they had inflicted it themselves. The Repton grave soil analysis showed killings took place over several days, not a massacre, but an orderly extermination. Among the remains was a skull carved with a runic inscription, Ek Betra Svar. I'm better this way. Someone carved the words after death, perhaps as justification. The skull belonged to a girl of 12 or 14, a young nun born in Norway, brought to England as a child and slain by her own kin to prevent her capture. Even in death, the Vikings sought to rationalize their cruelty. The inscription made their logic eternal. This system of sexual violence wasn't random savagery, it was law. The Icelandic Gragas Code recorded procedures for claiming nuns as property. The captor had to announce his right publicly before witnesses. A nun's resistance meant nothing, her consent was irrelevant. If she took her own life to escape, her captor could demand compensation from her family, 40 silver marks, the price of a life and a year's labour. Suicide, in their law, was theft of property. In 978, Ethelred became King of England. His first decree addressed Viking slave trading, not to abolish it, but to tax it. Royal customs records from London list duties on human cargo, 5 silver pieces per nun, 2 per child. The English weren't disgusted by Viking cruelty, they were envious of its profit. Maritime archaeology confirms how advanced this trade became. Shipwrecks along the North Sea show specialised ventilation shafts for living captives, water storage for weeks at sea, reinforced hulls for stability under human weight. These weren't raiding ships, they were designed for transport. One such vessel, dated to 912, could hold 80 souls below deck. Burn marks suggest it caught fire at sea, all cargo lost. 80 nuns perished in chains, the ocean their grave. Yet some resisted in ways the Chronicles refused to record. In scattered notes and skeletal evidence, faint traces remain. Broken shackles, crushed bones near riverbanks, fragments of rosary beads buried in mud. Proof that some nuns fought back, even knowing resistance meant a slower death. Their defiance is the one thing the sagas could never erase. A nun named Gunhild appears in the Frankish Chronicles, described as a freed Norse captive who turned her faith into vengeance. She had once worn chains, now she wore the cross like a weapon. Gunhild knew the Vikings' methods, their roots, their fears. For 7 relentless years, she led her own holy war against them. Frankish sources credit her with burning 12 Viking camps and freeing more than 300 nuns who had been taken from monasteries across the coast. She fought them using their own tactics: surprise raids, night attacks, no mercy, no prisoners. Her final assault targeted the great slave market at Rouen. Contemporary accounts speak of divine retribution, every Viking trader in the city executed with precision. 47 men died the same way, first mutilated, then left to bleed out. After that, Gunhild vanished from the record. But archaeological layers in burned Norse settlements along the Seine tell the rest of her story. Someone was hunting Vikings, someone who knew exactly where to strike and how to make them afraid. The practice of claiming defeated nuns spread beyond Scandinavia. By the 11th century, Norman sources described similar customs in newly conquered England. William's knights received land grants that included all chattels found there. Those chattels included nuns, listed beside livestock and grain. The Domesday Book catalogued it without shame, manor entries recording female dependents as property, valued like agricultural tools. Archaeological studies of Norman castles reveal how this system worked. Beneath the courtyards, stone cells with iron doors and no windows were built specifically for holding nuns. Some could contain 30 at a time. Bone fragments from these sites show infant mortality rates near 100%. The children born in these walls rarely survived. This wasn't neglect, it was policy. A child of forced union was evidence, and evidence was dangerous. Mixed blood meant scandal, liability, and divine shame. Erasure became standard procedure. In 1066, Harold Godwinson fell at Hastings, and England itself became a conquered land. The Norman invasion mirrored Viking custom perfectly. Systematic capture of Saxon nuns, forced marriages to Norman knights, and legal frameworks that redefined assault as holy union. Chroniclers of the time, blinded by victory, called it purification, the civilizing of the Saxon bloodline. But what history calls civilization was, in truth, ethnic cleansing through sexual violence. Dowries and inheritances turned faith into currency. A nun's body could legitimize land transfers. Consent was irrelevant. Church records whisper of resistance. Some Saxon nuns chose martyrdom, taking their own lives rather than submitting. Convent numbers tripled in the decade after Hastings. Abbeys filled with traumatized sisters seeking protection, yet even holy walls couldn't erase despair. Suicide among noble nuns rose so sharply that the church began calling it sanctified sacrifice, a death for purity's sake. The state called it destruction of property. Genetic research now exposes what the medieval scribes tried to bury. Isotope studies of graveyards show patterns of population mixing that trace directly along known Viking slave routes. Celtic and Saxon mitochondrial DNA appears in Scandinavian remains from the 9th century onward. It wasn't migration, it was reproduction through conquest. The Vikings created an empire of bloodlines. Modern Icelanders carry roughly 60% Celtic female. Norwegian populations show 40% from the British Isles. Each number represents hundreds of monasteries stormed, thousands of nuns taken, tens of thousands of births forced by terror. Recent excavations in Jorvik, modern York, reveal something even darker. Beneath layers of medieval rubble, archaeologists uncovered a structure unknown to any text: 64 individual cells cut into stone. Carbon dating places its construction around 876 CE. Every cell had chains embedded in the walls, iron rings polished smooth by constant restraint. This wasn't a prison, it was a breeding facility. Soil analysis shows continuous occupation for 40 years. Bone fragments tell a single story. Every occupant was a nun, everyone endured multiple pregnancies, and all were discarded when they could no longer bear children. The building stood in the very heart of York. Everyone would have known. Church records from the nearby cathedral list the baptisms of children born inside that facility. 732 births over 4 decades. Only 12 children lived past the age of 5. The records call them foundlings of unknown parentage. They were sold to wealthy families as servants, their existence used to fund new chapels and cloisters. God's work, financed by systematic violation. Financial ledgers from York Minster confirm regular payments to those who operated the building, not bribes, but official contracts for sanctuary services. The church wasn't a bystander, it was a partner. The pattern repeated across Viking-controlled Europe. Every major Norse settlement had its version of these facilities. Every bishopric kept baptismal ledgers for the offspring, every authority profited. The infrastructure was vast, the profits obscene, the suffering beyond measure. Yet even this industry of horror wasn't the end. The most devastating discovery comes again from Repton. Beneath the known mass grave of executed Norse nuns, archaeologists found deeper layers, multiple burial phases spanning 50 years. This wasn't a single massacre, it was generations of elimination. Chemical tests showed traces of mercury compounds in the bones, deliberate poisoning. The toxin acted slowly, causing madness before death. The victims would have raved and screamed, their minds disintegrating long before their bodies failed. It was a calculated cruelty, silenced the nuns by making them appear insane. Under Viking law, testimony from a madwoman held no weight. Madness erased truth, so they were poisoned, not merely to die, but to be disbelieved. Even those who survived long enough to tell their stories could no longer speak coherently. Their suffering became its own erasure.